She's fabulous, like really just incredible.
Okay, good evening. Thank you for coming this evening. This is again with some trepidation that I'm speaking before you. So I guess I'll speak now, and then we'll decide if we're going to post the video. But at least we can take a vote or something. Well, no, you don't. I'll vote with myself. I'm going to speak a little bit about demography before we begin, because I meant to say that last week, and I was covering. I think it'll help explain what I'm trying to do in this, in speaking about the frontiers of modern Orthodoxy. What exactly is this modern Orthodoxy of which I speak? So I looked for the numbers for 2013. The ASBI Foundation did a survey of Jewish day schools in 2013, and as of that year, if you look at modern Orthodox high schools and centrist Orthodox high schools, combined, there were about 2,500 12th graders. So let's say they're also Orthodox families sending their kids to non-Jewish private schools, to public high schools, to non-Orthodox Jewish high schools, so maybe that's another 500 kids. That gives us a cohort of our community, of the modern and centrist Orthodox community, of about 3,000 12th graders, 3,000. So every year, there are 3,000 modern centrist Orthodox kids who become adults. That means if you're finished high school within a few years of 2013, 2014, that means your cohort of modern Orthodox is about 3,000 people. There are about 2,999 people your age, okay, who grew up in our community, raised by modern Orthodox families. So is that number, is that like surprisingly low to you? Is that surprisingly high? Or that, what? Small, right? So it sort of puts things in perspective, right? Like it's
in Chicago.
No, in the entire country. Maybe including Canada. I'm not sure. I don't remember. How many Canadians could there be? I don't know. So maybe it's either with or without Canada. I don't know. But it's in terms of the scale of of our what?
There are a few of us.
So you can find the ASBI Foundation used to do these day school censuses, and so they just went through every yeshiva, day school, Chabad, JC, whatever, just by age and by segment of the community, and they just did a census. And so it was no one had done that before. They did one. They've done several over the years. I think the most recent was 2013, 2014. It showed a decline in some day school populations after the financial collapse of 2008. Slow recovery, decimation of the Solomon Schechter movement, whatever things that you may know about, but you can put real numbers to it. So I just, in terms, again, the size of our community, it's not necessarily enough modern Orthodox Jews in America that we can marry each other, right? It's just 3,000 people spread across the country, right? Or that's, it's not a lot. It means a lot of us are, going to one direction to the other, in our religious journeys that we take in terms of who we end up marrying. We're not such a large community. We're a minority within the Orthodox community, which is itself a small segment of the American Jewish population. In Israel, the numbers are very different, but that's sort of here our community. So I guess that just means it's kind of preposterous to talk about mainstream Orthodoxy or the frontiers of Orthodoxy, because we're talking about something which is itself pretty small. And there are certain institutions within the American Orthodox community that see themselves as mainstream. I think Yeshiva University, very much speaks about itself, sees itself as mainstream, and the rabbis who studied there and the shuls that it's a very important part of their identity. I think that's a religious statement they're making about themselves. From a standpoint of demography, it's ridiculous. Okay, because in the Yeshiva University is not a mainstream Orthodox institution. Demographically, it is in the sense of their self-conception. So I think that's kind of worth keeping in mind. Nonetheless, I'm going to try to talk about tonight I'm going to talk about my own progression and evolution of some of my own thoughts about this topic, sexuality, but also then talk about some conversations that are having on the periphery of our community, but again, periphery of a what? The entire population of Jews in the world is within the margin of error of the Chinese census. So to talk about the, periphery of the modern Orthodox community is talking about, it's 5 people and two of them, okay? That's... So my Orthodox history, I became Orthodox as a teenager in the Upper West Side of Manhattan, And as my Orthodox identity emerged, I had some more right-wing Orthodox influences and some more liberal Orthodox influences. But as as my mature thinking developed in high school, as it does, it was clear to me that I, came from the, the modern wing of modern Orthodoxy, and as that was expressed, in the 90s in Manhattan, I think issues of sexuality, homosexuality, which was not something that I was aware that people talked about. It was just like not, it's I don't think it doesn't feel, from my perspective, to be that long ago, but it was, in this issue, it was like centuries ago in some way. I recently had a conversation with one of my children, and I told him that as recently as 2012, both Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama were opposed to same-sex marriage, and he didn't believe me. Like it wasn't a reasonable thing for a reasonable person to that to be opposed to same-sex marriage as a matter of public policy was not something that a reasonable person, certainly not like someone he knew of as role models, admirable liberal politicians would actually advocate. He couldn't comprehend that that stance. He couldn't wrap his mind around it, and. Yeah, that was needless to say, not the world that I grew up in high school. There were, I don't think I wasn't aware. Obviously there were gay people in my high school. I wasn't aware of it for any of them or teachers. And relatively recently, I saw on Facebook a guy I was friends with in college, who part of the Jewish community in college. We weren't best buddies, but we knew each other. We in my class, we spent 4 years together, Shabbos meals, tefillah, Hillel leadership activities, 4 years together, and I had no idea that he was gay until I saw his wedding pictures, within the last 6 months or something. So it was, maybe 10 years ago he told people, but in other words, when we were in college together, I didn't know. So just in terms of I'm just trying to remind you what life was like, in the turn of the century, and for those of you who don't remember what life was like back then, just to sort of share again, my own sort of how I, the history of my own thinking and the context for that. In 2003, the movie Trembling Before God was released. I think I saw that in theaters, and that was a documentary about gay Orthodox Jews that was, I think, really, I don't know, sort of brought this issue to to be something we talk about. And there were several different individuals profiled in the movie, some of them anonymously as silhouettes, just speaking for the camera, but in a very sympathetic way. And they all had different relationships with their Orthodoxy, and they all had different relationships with their sexuality and their identity. And but it was this is a thing that is worth grappling with, that this is 2 to 5% of our community, and let's think about it, to put myself in their shoes, or how are they experiencing our communities. 2004, Rabbi Chaim Rappaport, or maybe I don't know when he published it. I read Rabbi Chaim Rappaport's book called Judaism and Homosexuality, an authentic Orthodox position or something. Rappaport is a significant Talmud Chacham, he is British. He was a congregational rabbi. I think he still is a congregational rabbi. I wrote a very erudite book exploring various facets of homosexuality from an Orthodox halachic perspective, and he doesn't, it's I guess sort of the halachic novelty of the book, or what was groundbreaking about it. He says gay people should not marry people of the opposite gender, should not stifle their sexuality and marry people of the opposite gender, which seems, I think, maybe self-evident and common sense, but that was contrary to very common advice that he felt was given, that he encountered in the community, was trying to counter. And he just recognized that this is a real thing, that gay people it's not a perversion, it's not a delusion, it's a actual way that human sexuality works in some people, and that therefore the halachic restrictions on their life represent a religious, psychological, personal challenge that those of us who aren't gay can barely imagine, of having no halachic avenue towards not just sexual gratification, but also companionship and family, and all these things that our community emphasizes so much. And he wrote about it, I think, in a frank way, without apologetics, and I thought that, and that book also, I think, was, again, for me, that was a significant like book to read, and you know, and I think, you know, it was influential in the community as well. A few years later, let's jumping forward a few years later, in my studies at yeshiva in rabbinical school, I became aware of what I will call like secondary issues related to sexuality and homosexuality, and that I sort of had not contemplated. For example, like a case, you know, gay couple wants to register their kid in the local day school. Can they register their kid in the local day school? They, you know, traveled to 3 cities trying to find a yeshiva that will admit their child, and each time they're rejected, they're told, they wonder, is there a place for us in the community? Case 2. 25-year-old man with a young child suddenly realizes as an adult that his divorced mother's like really good friend is actually her lesbian partner, and has decided that he doesn't want this woman to be part of his life, doesn't want her to be have any access to his children, and you know his mother, her partner are distraught. The partner raised him, right? She entered the family's life. I'm making up the details. Okay, she entered the family's life when he was 5 years old. She saw him grow up. She raised him, and in their Orthodox community in the 80s, you know, they told a story that this was, you know, mom's really great friend who's around a lot, who spends weekends with the family, et cetera, et cetera. She had a great affection for him and was just so heartbroken about this, and the mother and the relationship with the grandmother and the biological grandmother and the grandkid is like, you know, like so this guy goes to the rabbi and asks, Rabbi, can I expose my child to my mother and her partner? I think that's a secondary issue. Third case, closeted gay man, 5 children, aged 3 to 15, reaches a crisis point where he can't maintain the facade of his marriage and leaves his wife, still living a closeted lifestyle, and his wife is distraught that her marriage has fallen apart, but she's also confused. She doesn't understand. What did she do to lose this marriage? And he can't tell because he feels, what will the impact have on my children and their place in the community if this comes out? So he has to keep it a secret from his wife, from his children, from himself, right, for the sake of the children. But by doing that, the pain that this causes too. So these stories were presented to me these are all, you know, again, I made up the details. They were based on true stories. I don't know where these true stories happened, but they were told to me by a rabbi who encountered these stories or versions of these stories in real life. And the point he made, which I think is true, and I've become convinced is true, is that when people feel the need to keep core parts of their identity secret, then the circle of pain expands in concentric circles, and more innocent victims get kind of roped into this pain and suffering. And that led, at least again, my narrative of my life, to 2010, when the Statement of Principles was drafted and signed. This was it was a response, and the backstory is there was Yeshiva University had hosted a panel discussion featuring several young gay Orthodox Jews who I guess were at yeshiva or had been, you know, yeshiva. These, you know, people who were raised lev liba of American modern Orthodox community, and they spoke at this panel in very open ways. And there was like a backlash from some of the Rosh Yeshiva that was fairly harsh. And in response to the backlash, 3 teachers of mine, actually, Rabbi Aryeh Clapper, whom I quote frequently, Rabbi Yitzi Blau, who spoke here last year and who I quote frequently, and Rabbi Natty Helfgott, who's not yet spoken here, but who was a teacher of mine at YCT. Maybe we'll bring him. He's on the circuit. So they drafted this together, this statement of principles on the role of gay Jews in the Orthodox community. And and they clarified, and this statement of principles was then shopped around and was signed by, I don't know, several hundred rabbis and educators and psychologists within the Orthodox community. The statement of principles said a few things. It reiterated what they felt was a halachic position that the only halachically legitimate form of human sexuality was in the confines of a heterosexual marriage, and that same-sex marriage had no place in Orthodoxy and shouldn't be performed, celebrated, but that gay people have the right to refuse reparative therapy, which they reasonably believe is harmful and ineffective. They have a right to be open about their identity or private about their identity, and that to force somebody to either be closeted or to disclose their identity were sort of violations of their personal dignity, and that the community owed an obligation to treat gay Jews with the same full panoply of interpersonal mitzvot, and et cetera, as any other Jew, and that gay Jews should be encouraged to perform all mitzvot to the best of their ability to remain integrated in the community, and they should be afforded sort of leadership roles and ritual roles, as would befit anyone else in comparable circumstances. And I think that's basically, it's online, you can find it on the internet if you haven't read it recently or ever encountered it. It's easy. If you have any difficulty, this is not behind a paywall. Unlike the article I recommended last week, this one is definitely free. It's definitely on the internet, and I can easily give you the website. So I think it was a successful document insofar it was the people who, from a standpoint of sociology, it was successful because the people who signed it were not just the usual suspects of the Orthodox left. They were people with more mainstream or centrist affiliations felt comfortable signing the document, and it was sufficiently. I know that it was sufficiently progressive and cutting edge because there were people who didn't sign it very pointedly and felt it was kind of going too far and really it was too liberal. So that to me, just on the basis, which doesn't mean that doesn't mean it's correct. It just means that it actually was effective in identifying a location in the spectrum where you could get lots and lots of important, influential people to sign something, but nonetheless, it was still saying something new and controversial because, as evidenced by all the people who didn't sign it. Okay, so that. I thought it was, what I appreciated about it was and I did sign, my name is still there. And some people who signed it have actually unsigned it in the decades since it came out, but I've not yet felt the need to do so, or sufficient reason to do so. I think it solves a lot of those secondary issues, right? It says, yes, of course we want your kids in our day schools. Yes, of course we want you to be in our shuls. Yes, of course we want you to be from and do mitzvot and be and learn daf yomi and daven for the Yamud. Of course, and we don't see a way to fundamentally rethink the sort of volumes of our sexual mitzvot and isurim and prohibitions. In 20, so far, so any questions so far, or comments, reactions so far? I'll say one other thing about it. Oh, sorry. One other thing, sort of a concept that sort of came to my mind, I call it I'm not sure if I actually called it this before, but I the term that, it's sort of I call it the heteronormativity paradox. I think precisely because there is such a really intense ethos of heteronormativity in the Orthodox community, and such an emphasis on marriage and babies and all that stuff, right? And men sit here, women sit there, it's pretty stark. I think that means that somebody who grows up in our community who realizes about himself or herself that I'm gay, it's probably not a mistake. That's probably not a phase they're going through in college, right? That's probably something that they've really thought really long and hard about. I'm sure everyone. I'm not assuming other people don't think long and hard about this, but the anxiety that you sometimes see expressed that. How deep-rooted is sexuality in the psyche, and can such a person, ever, be happy in a heterosexual relationship? I feel I'm just less inclined to have those, to give credence to those concerns when, like, regarding an individual who like grew up in our community or a community like ours. I just think there's like so much like pushing in the other direction that somebody who nonetheless like learns about himself that he's gay, that's probably true. Okay, so I call that the heteronormativity paradox, like precisely because of the heteronormativity of our community, which I think somewhat committed to like kind of maintaining. Precisely for that reason, someone who like learns about himself that he is gay, like that, I think it deserves a lot of like to taken really a lot of respect and taken seriously. Again, everyone deserves respect, but do you understand what do you get it? Okay. We moved to Lakeview in 2013. I'll tell you one tangential, not really related, but somewhat related story from our first few weeks in Lakeview. We were driving someplace through the past Lakeshore Drive, and we were sort of driving through the park, and there was one of these charity races, and the theme of this race was everyone wore wings on their backs. I don't know if this happens every year or just that one year. Have you seen it? Okay. So it's okay. So we were driving, and Noam, who was I guess in second grade, 7 years old, he said, why are there all these fairies around? And Sarah said, no, I'm who taught you how can you speak that way? I was like, no. And look, there are people dressed up in wings. They're actually, he has a point, So that was Lakeview. So I think moving here, I think it was the first time I had really people I was close with who were gay. Is that true? It could be true. People who I interacted with very regularly on a daily, weekly basis. This is the first time, pretty sure the first time I met gay Orthodox couples raising children. I don't think I had met, known people like that in that situation before I came here. And I thought that was a neat thing about our community. But I guess my first months here, a member of the community confided to me that he was gay. There's nothing that he had told other people, and he doesn't live here anymore. And he was in agony. It took him so long to tell me. He sat in silence in my office for minutes before he could get the words out of his mouth. I actually, while that was happening, I was thinking, oh, he probably killed somebody because he feels really guilty. I actually had that thought. Did he what could be so bad that he it's so hard for him to say? That's where my mind was going. This was not I don't know if you. I often people call me. People want to say. I always think I wonder what this is about. And sometimes I'm right, and often I'm wrong. So I was wrong about this. And what I wanted to tell him, was something just look at all these happy gay couples living in our shul. Just figure it out, and then and then you can just pass through the other side, and then you'll be like them, and everything's gonna be great. But I realized that what I meant by figure it out was come up with some theology that can lead you to embrace your sexual identity and and seek a partnership with another man. And once you work out that part, the community is totally ready in open arms to embrace you, and you can live a happy life like this couple and that couple, that right here in our shul. And I just felt that wasn't fair, because that's not his job, that's my job, right? I'm that. So I felt deeply dissatisfied in myself that I couldn't help him in that moment. I think out of that dissatisfaction, he experienced the meeting as horrifically awkward and unhelpful, and I feel great guilt that I wasn't able to be more compassionate and supportive to him. And I think that but I didn't know what else I could have said, because I haven't worked out the theology for myself, and so I certainly couldn't tell him, give it to him. I subsequently, just as another tangent, I've subsequently heard Rabbi Steve Greenberg, the first Orthodox gay rabbi, I heard, or I didn't hear him this in person, I heard a lecture, like a recording of a lecture, he said, what he would hope a rabbi in my position would say was something like, which I found very powerful, and like if maybe that would, I kind of wish I had said something, some version of this, something like, whatever you decide to do, if I should die before you, and I'm in a position to do so, when you stand before Kadosh Baruch Hu in judgment, I'll stand next to you. So it's a powerful thing to offer someone, and it really gave me chills when I heard him say that, and so that's something maybe I could say, but I didn't know that was something one could say back then. So here we are. That's sort of where we are. That's where I am. That was 2013. I don't know if it progressed much. Personally, I say no, I have a good line now I could use, but I haven't solved the problem. I think as a shul, there's I'm not aware of any voice in the shul that's upset that there are gay couples living here, raising children, and sort of being part of our community like that. If that sentiment exists, it's never been expressed to me or in my earshot. We've sort of, on the other hand, I don't officiate same-sex weddings, and the shul doesn't celebrate them, and I think that's a big asterisk next to people living openly in the community. It's not all that open if you pay the same dues as everyone else, but the rabbi won't officiate your wedding. We sort of conclude, there was we sort of reached a policy that the shul will only celebrate weddings that are Orthodox, halachic, chuppah v'kiddushin, kedat Moshe Yisrael, but that every birth of every human being is a gift from God that should be celebrated and deserves a mazel tov, no matter who the parents are and the kid's status and the technology that may have been involved in bringing that kid into the world. Every human being is a gift from God and it should be celebrated. So that's sort of this medium place where we are as in terms of policy, which I think it works. I think I can defend it. I think the place where it hasn't yet been fully tested is will we refuse to celebrate heterosexual marriages that are not chuppah v'kiddushin kedat Moshe Yisrael and an Orthodox understanding of all those terms, and that would be the test case. Is it are we consistent about this? And so that remains to be seen if we're going to be consistent about that. Beyond the walls of things that I'm involved in directly, sort of what's happening on the frontiers, on the periphery. So there are a couple of different endeavors that are taking place. So there's activism that targeted activism. ASHL has this school pledge. They want to get Jewish schools to publicly declare that gay students will be embraced and supported by the school. I actually don't know if they've been successful in getting schools to actually sign on. I think it's a reasonable ask to make, and a sister organization of ASHL in the United Kingdom was successful over a period of years in working in creating a very powerful document from the Chief Rabbi's office in the United Kingdom, Rabbi Mervis, which says just that gay kids in our schools should be supported and protected by their teachers and by their school. It's not a, it's once you say it that way, it seems why wouldn't you embrace that? But and it's great that Rabbi Mervis took that stance, and I would hope that schools here could take that stand as well. I think sometimes there's things become politicized, and it's just a shame that because things become politicized, you don't do the right thing. If you do, I don't know. That seems a shame to me. There are gay couples who are, Orthodox gay couples who are getting married and are forming marriage ceremonies. Generally, these are framed halakhically as something like a either mutual nidarim, like you're allowed to make a neder in halakha, or maybe the Talmud discourages nidarim, but it used to be a very common part of Jewish life, which is in the Torah. It's the whole Masechet of the Talmud about nidarim, that vows you could take, sort of restrict things upon yourself. So you can take a vow of faithfulness of one kind or another to a partner by making a neder. That means if you break it, it's a pretty serious halachic, violation. There are couples who then sign some type of documents of shutfut, that they combine their property, like a sort of a financial partnership, and they do both of these standing under a chuppah, wearing tuxedos, and that's it's a wedding, right? They're celebrating a wedding, and that's a way to kind of do Jewish rituals to celebrate this life cycle event, to add Jewish gravitas to their marriages, and this is happening, and
officiated by rabbis?
That's a good question. So the answer is yes, and so the short answer is yes. The long answer is also yes. And those, I guess, rabbis are I would say, on the frontiers of Orthodoxy. I have a few colleagues who have publicly done this in public, been photographed doing it, and written essays explaining why they feel this is a step they should take. These are, not people I know very well, but people I know casually. They're people I respect. I wish that they would, I think, write a tshuva, you can't, I don't, a JTA op-ed explaining that you're going to perform same-sex marriage, I think, doesn't do justice to the cause you're trying to advance, or to the community that you're trying to serve. It's like the Declaration of Independence begins, course of human events, da-da-da-da. What's the phrase? Anyone know it by heart? Anyone? What? Okay, something like...
In the course of human events, it becomes necessary for...
one nation to dissolve the bonds. Go on, then what's the part? But something like, if we respect other people, we have to explain why, right? That's the next part, okay? And then the declaration, okay? If you want people to respect what we're doing, we have to, give them an account of why we're taking this step. So I just feel like that is a tshuva, it's a sefer, it's not a 500-word, op-ed in the forward. That's my disappointment with those rabbis, but... maybe one of them or someone else will write some document. I think there's claiming, look, there's nothing, their argument is, I'm going to try to do it justice. The argument is, there's the part, a couple of arguments it's sort of there's nothing, two people making nidarim, pledging to treat each other with faithfulness and love and respect, that's not violating a prohibition. Two people pooling the resources, that's not violating a prohibition. Same-sex marriage is not something that halakha recognizes, but therefore it's not something that it prohibits, because it's just not a concept that one finds in halakhic literature, and so how could it be prohibited? Furthermore, while there are Torah prohibitions on same-sex intimacy, that's not what a marriage is about, okay, right? People, and who knows what the couple is or is not, whatever, we don't know the practices that the couple is or is not doing in the privacy of their home. That's really none of our business. That's their relationship with each other and their relationship with God. But we do know that there's a great value that in finding partnership and companionship and building a home together, and that's something that we should celebrate and endorse. So that's the condensed version of an already short argument. I think it needs fleshing out. It needs to be advocated for with greater scholarship. I think if to have any resonance in the Orthodox community, which is a community that values scholarship and wants you to prove your assertions and demonstrate that. Yeah.
Do you think there's a reason why someone hasn't written that tshuva?
I think there's a disconnect between the people who are writing tshuvot and the people who are activists on the front lines. And I think that's a problem, because it leads, and this is this is true for like everything we're talking about in this whole series. That was true last week's issues too. Like there's a disconnect. People don't feel that the post-scheme really appreciate our values, and they're probably a little bit right about that. And people from our camp, like the modern wing of modern Orthodoxy, we're not educating in a way that produces post-scheme. And even when one emerges, we kind of tear them down when they say something we disagree with. So that sort of hurts their potential to become like broad-shouldered post-scheme if we yell at them when we don't like what they say. So that ends up with a situation where the post-scheme are coming from other communities. I think it's a problem. There were ways to address it. It's a problem. I want to say this in a way that protects the innocent. There's somebody I know who is, they told us about the experience of being a young 20-something, like someone my age, so when we were all young 20-something, newly married couples, this woman described how women her age went about asking rabbis for permission to use birth control after marriage. And there was at least this whole underground network of ask this rabbi and he'll say that, and if you cry, when you're speaking to him, for sure you'll get 2 years of, a hetzer for 2 years, so that, and to me that episode is that's not oh, that's so pious, they're asking, to me that's just, that's like a broken system, right? Because that's not a shaila. That's like manipulation. It's like I need a rabbi to sprinkle his magic heter juice on my life, or check this box. It's like signing an exam to show the teacher. I need to go through that experience, but I don't actually trust his values. I don't feel that if I say I want to finish my graduate degree before becoming a mother, that I don't feel like that's something that's going to resonate for him. That he'll appreciate that and validate that. Nor do I feel that he has any wisdom to share that could impact my life decisions. So it's in every direction, that to me indicates brokenness. And that's not ubiquitous, but that's because I think it is, appropriate to have a conversation. I think there are decisions that couples could make that can't be, halakhically justified, and a rabbi can provide guidance, or someone with Torah knowledge could provide guidance for those conversations, could share values that could help a couple, but only if they feel this trust, only if they feel that their own values and their own life priorities are going to be validated or understood, or can be listened to with some amount of sympathy. Okay, that was a little of a tangent, but not irrelevant. I think there's also conversations about, I would say one other, I had a conversation with a local Chicago rabbi who was sort of questioning this shul's openness to gay couples participating. How could you have people who are violating such severe prohibitions, to celebrate those family, and at the time when I had this conversation, I didn't have a snappy comeback or any. I just didn't have much to say. I don't know, I was sort of flustered. But if I had my druthers, I would have said. It just says actually, we have no idea what choices people are making in terms of various prohibitions in the Torah. That's just I have no knowledge about that. People have not discussed that with me, and so that I don't know that. I know that people want companionship and they want to build households within this community, and they want to raise children. And I don't see prohibitions in any of those activities. In terms of actual sexual intimacy, I think there's some conversations happening around that too. I think there is what's his name? Steve Greenberg, has written a book in which he sort of has a revised understanding of the Torah's verses that prohibit male homosexual intercourse, and that you can read it for yourself and decide if it's convincing or not. It's certainly not how those verses have been understood, by a pretty like consistent chain of tradition of Jews who like read the Torah and tried to observe the Torah for thousands of years. And that's a pretty, to me, that's a theological kind of challenge. Like, I don't know how our way of life can survive. I don't know what that's overly dramatic, and I don't know what it looks like for a like normative verse in the Torah to be understood in a dramatically new way than it has been understood pretty consistently for thousands of years. I don't know. It's hard for me to think of another example of like where we have thousands of years of like codes and commentary, understanding something more or less in one way, and then saying, "Oh, this is new information. It actually means something entirely different from what we always thought it did." That I don't. If we make that move, I don't know how like the rest of the structure kind of survives that. And so that's like maybe a challenge. So convince me I'm wrong, or maybe maybe the postgame are out there and they'll come up with something, and there'll be some essay or some article, some book that will convince me I'm wrong, and so I'm left with again I just sort of it's sort of people are suffering because of my theological problem, and that I really don't like. That's a stance that I feel really untenable. That like my religious discomfort is actually I'm not the one suffering from this religious discomfort, right? So, but in order to have a theology about how God gave the Torah and how we interpret it, and the consistent Orthodox halachic norms of like how we follow the Masorah of interpreting psukim and halachot. So in order to maintain that, like other people are gonna be suffering, and that's a dynamic that's not quite fair, right? It's like so the Beit wrote very powerfully about the model of the Akedah that that we have to sacrifice sometimes, literally precious things, and because in response to God's command. But the problem is that it's not. It's like you're being sacrificed for my right, and that's a problematic dynamic when someone else is suffering for my religious virtuosity. There are people, again people noting that another discussion that's being made is that there's like maybe secondary. Sexual intimacy that isn't intercourse is maybe only a rabbinic prohibition, or if it's a biblical prohibition, it's a lesser prohibition, and the point that rabbinic prohibitions are also prohibitions. I had a rabbi who said there's a hell for Drabanans also. Like we're not allowed to discuss things Drabanan doesn't mean it's okay. But I'll say this, and maybe this will say something also that's important to say something about. Heterosexuals who also have sexual identity and sexuality. So there's, the Torah says, when the Torah lists its prohibited sexual relationships, it uses the phrase lo tikrevu, like don't approach to, uncover the nakedness, meaning to have sex with this person or that person or the other person. What does lo tikrevu, what does approaching mean? And there is some machlokes between the Rambam and the Ramban about whether or not we would call like foreplay, like non-intercourse sexual intimacy, whether that is a biblical prohibition under this rubric of lo tikrevu or not, okay, or whether those are Drabanans. Everyone agrees that if you can't have sex with somebody, foreplay is also forbidden with those individuals. The question is whether that's D'oraita or Drabanan. That seems to be the same. That dispute would seem to be the same for gay people also. Not forms of sexual intimacy that isn't intercourse is maybe D'Rabbanan, or it's a D'oraita, but there's different D'oraita of lo tikrevu, but it's the same D'oraita whether someone's gay or straight. Which means that if there are gay people who are not having intercourse and having some other form of intimacy, that's the same exact identical prohibition as a straight couple, which isn't having intercourse but is having some other type of sexual intimacy outside, okay? So I've been told that there are neighborhoods populated by large numbers of Orthodox singles who come to shul on Shabbat and keep kosher very carefully and really are strong in their Orthodox identity. And also, some people in that community are engaging in various degrees of sexual intimacy before they're married. And there are, entire communities with lots and lots of people in this stage of life engaging in that sort of activity. Maybe you've visited a community like that or know people in this situation. So that's the same, right? That's the same, right? In other words, like there are rabbis who 90% of their shuls, who show up on Friday night. That's that's the life situation that they're in, and that's the same as that might be the same as what gay couples are doing also. So somehow our community is able to like tolerate or like sort of like turn a blind eye or sort of pretend not to know about this type of deviation from halakha for people in a life stage which makes full halakhic observance challenging. We do it for heterosexual people pretty routinely. It's not endorsing, but it's just like kind of, this is who they are. This is their stage in life. This is the lifestyle that this community, this segment of our community is living in, and those are like 90% of the people who are in our shul right now, right? And somehow the walls of the shul don't collapse, and there's space for them, and that's exactly the same. Whatever it's right to Drabanan, whatever it is, it's the same for a gay couple engaging in similar activities. So I think that's also, I know that to me seems significant. Since I mentioned, since I talked about straight people, I said us about sexuality more broadly and sexual ethics. Actually, questions or comments first, because I don't, yeah? Sorry, yeah, then one, two.
You said that it'd be very difficult for you to imagine a structure in which we're taking a verse and reading it totally different than we have been for 1,000 years. Is that more or less difficult than taking that verse and saying, we know what it's saying, this is a matter of human dignity, that it's a once in 1,000 years issue, that we are going to have to sideline it and do what's best for.
Yeah, so that argument was made by Aaron Kohler, right? Professor Aaron Kohler, who's a Bible scholar at Yeshiva University. He had an op-ed also, in which he basically, I think it's a fair summary of his point, which is, I don't know what to do about the halakhic problem, but I know there's an ethical problem that confronts me. I have to do the right thing, and for him that means embracing, and that means welcoming. So I think that's fine, and I guess I sort of want to push him and say, like, tachlis. So does that mean you're going to officiate at a wedding, right? Because you're like you're really embracing. So like, okay, so like so before my wedding, right? You're going to do that, Professor Kohler? Like, I don't know. So I don't know what he would say. Maybe he would say yes, maybe he would say no. It's sort of hard to say. You can't always write off say, well, I'm not dealing with halakha. I'm just dealing with like just the ethical imperative before me to embrace people, right? I think at some point, like the question gets pushed, like, no. Like you have a halakhic issue on your hands, okay? Or if somebody whatever. There could be other halakhic questions that it can't evade. Somebody serving a witness that right?
But even if someone were to take that all the way and say, that not only is we know what this says, and we are going to totally go against it. Would those walls crumble in the same way?
Oh, I see. In other words, of course it is forbidden, and I'm going to encourage people to violate this Torah prohibition because it's immoral, because it's untenable, because it's, I don't know. I mean, I think to say it's untenable, we have mitzvot that are impossible to perform, and we generally don't force people to do impossible mitzvot. Prohibitions, we say there are prohibitions that are impossible to abide by, and we say, okay, so you break Shabbos to save your life. So I think that's write a book, I don't know. Put it in your safer, see what you come up with.
That's sort of what the CJLS was tshuva from whatever, how many years ago. That was basically their argument for permitting the tshuva.
My understanding is that those positions were sort of going in the I didn't read them. The summaries in the press at the time was that anything other sexual intimacy that isn't anal intercourse is Drabanan, and therefore Drabanans are overridden by Kavod HaBriot. Right. So I don't think that's true. I don't think Drabanans are overridden by Kavod HaBriot. I think that's mistaken. Second, I don't think anyone abides by that tshuva in either. I don't think there are people who were celibate until that tshuva was published, and then they said, "Oh, now there's permission to have these lower levels of intimacy." Nor do I think there are people in the conservative movement who limit their sexual. I mean, I asked a gay friend who circulates in that world, and he didn't feel that it was sort of necessary to get JTS to admit gay students. That tshuva did not impact people's lives. So in that sense, it solved one problem that doesn't really pertain to us. It was like a JTS institutional problem it solved in terms of people's like in their anxiety, angst and distress. It didn't actually. I don't know if it solved those problems.
But it sounded like the same argument.
What's that, Dr. Halper?
Like social problem.
It solves social problems by.
Meaning just alleviating maybe like homophobia within a conservative.
Sure.
That affects people's lives.
Sure.
My job in this situation is easier than yours. I'm a religious physician, not a rabbi. But it seems to me that there ought to be a way of addressing the prohibition in Leviticus in terms of what is known today about biology and what was known at that time about biology. And I guess this gets into the question of the literal truth of Leviticus. Was this Moshe's interpretation of what God said? What did God really mean? Would God want us to treat some of his children in this way?
Yeah. So I think treating children this way, I think, I don't know, I feel comfortable saying God wants us to treat all God's children in a very loving, embracing way. I think Orthodoxy seems to be dependent on this idea that the Torah is God's direct word. I guess we'll talk about this next week. This is a good segue for next week. Like, Torah is God's word to Moshe, and that there's a chain of understanding. It's also that there's a tradition of understanding of what, like, the legal, Torah says, "Lo tivashel gedi b'chelev imo," don't boil a kid in its mother's milk. What does that mean? So the pshat, who knows what the pshat is, but the legal meaning of that verse was determined once and forever by Chazal, by the rabbis of the Talmudic era, who said it means, 3 times the Torah says, "Lo tivashel gedi b'chelev imo," which means there's a biblical prohibition against cooking all dairy and meat together, eating the product of dairy meat that had been cooked together, or deriving benefit from dairy meat that were cooked together. That was like in the Midrashim thousands of years ago, and it's never been questioned since then. It can't be questioned since then, and it's rooted in a verse, 3 verses in the Torah. That's God's will. And Orthodoxy and our whole way of life, I think, is predicated on not messing with that. So I think to find I don't know. So there are all sorts of things you could say. Well, the Torah had to make sense not only for us but also for them, and so God put mitzvot in the Torah that were really necessary then, but maybe they're not necessary. Rambam sort of says that about sacrifices. God put a lot of sacrifices in the Torah, not because God needs sacrifices, but because every religion that was worth its salt back then had animal sacrifices. And if we didn't have animal sacrifices in the Torah, people would have said, this religion has no animal sacrifices. Who needs it? This is ridiculous. What kind of religion is this? So God put animal sacrifices in the Torah, commanded us to perform animal sacrifices because we had to take the religion seriously way back then. So maybe you could say there are other things that are there in the Torah because it was necessary back then, but that's still different from, maybe that helps some of the theological questions, or it helps you kind of reconcile yourself to some of the slavery and some of the patriarchy kind of had to make sense to ancient people, so it kind of operates within that framework. But I don't know that gives us I don't know how far that gets us in terms of radical revisions legally. I'm not sure. Natalia, you want to say something?
Yeah, maybe I misunderstood what you're saying, so I apologize. Correct me if I'm wrong. But part of your critique of what I heard about the CJLS tshuva was that it didn't change or affect people's practice, right?
Yes.
So I'm wondering if you would say that there's never been a ruling from an Orthodox rabbi that was made because he knew that if he went stricter, his community would just ignore it and break what his psak was.
You're critiquing my critique by saying Orthodox rabbis do that also. We say things, yes. Fair critique, okay? Fair critique, and I apologize if I offended. I guess I think I think there's a religious power in the shaila tshuva kind of dynamic of somebody. That's why I was so bothered by those birth control stories I shared before, because that's like distortion of something really very sacred. Of I'm trying to live my life according to God's guidance, and I'm turning to Torah scholarship to give me that guidance, and I have emunah, my faith in the system and in God and God's Torah is such that I'm going to do difficult things in response to what you tell me the Torah means. That's a pretty powerful thing from both ends. It's like real emunah in the rabbi or the person being asked the question, that like he or she has the knowledge and the yirat shamayim to provide like good, responsible, authentic guidance, and it's tremendous emunah on the person who's asking the question. I'm putting my life in your hands. Sometimes people ask really fraught questions about really significant things. So that's like I think it's like there's real sacredness in that moment, and so that's sort of yeah. So I apologize for being overly dismissive, and whatever. Objection sustained. Okay, so thank you. Do you want 5 minutes of heterosexual sexuality? Straight people also. Okay, so I just want to say two quick. It's like a point I think is important. And on one thing, this idea again, so that in case you meet him and hear him speak about it, you shouldn't think that he's copying me. I'm copying him. This is an idea that I heard from Rabbi T. Blanchard, who lived in Chicago for a period of time and was a teacher of mine in yeshiva. Pointed out. Once it's pointed out, it's sort of obvious that sexuality in the Torah comes at the intersection of two sort of vast systems of mitzvot in the Torah. One is the system of Tumah v'Tahara, like the Torah's purity regulations, which was once 1/6 of the entire oral Torah, like a vast system, which now only remains like vestiges of this like huge system. We wash our hands before we eat bread. We have mikvah, okay, but it's like really, it's just like a to feel like kalim, like a few like things, in our, I'm going to minimize whatever, but like relative to like how like this massive system of the Torah, right? So sexual mitzvot come up in that context in the Torah, which means it's about access to the Beit HaMikdash and holy things and holiness, and that's one which sort of makes sense. You think about like the stories we're reading in the Torah, like right now about how important it was and the challenge of our patriarchs and matriarchs, like having children who would pass on their sacred mission to, right? So sexuality is sort of introduced in that context in the Torah, and it's also introduced in the context of interpersonal ethics, which is also a vast system. And right in that nexus, that's where the sexual mitzvot are in the Torah. I think the Orthodox community, by and large, tends to emphasize the Tumah v'Tahara aspects of sexual mitzvot and to de-emphasize the like interpersonal ethics piece of it. If, you could like sprinkle like magic mikvah water over, the whole neighborhood, it wouldn't like make everything that happened like ethical and just, like there'd still be like ethical problems, even if like all this like Tumah v'Tahara stuff could be like sort of magically, right? If it had like if it rained mikvah water or something, which I guess it does technically, but yes, right, exactly. Raining buckets, raining mikvah, okay? Right, it wouldn't, if you brought, it wouldn't, and they're like, the Torah has really like high demands for how we treat other people. Like you're not allowed to, if you're a merchant selling apples, you can't put the good apples on top and your mealy apples on the bottom. Like that's misleading, okay? You can't present yourself as one thing when you're, really something else. You can't, you can't use other people for your own ends, right? There's without, disclosing what your own interests are, right? There's lots of like pretty important mitzvot about how we treat other people, how we present ourselves to other people, how we ask other people for things, about integrity and openness. And I think a lot of, I think that also is, like all those things are also true when people are in an intimate relationship. They don't become less true in that context, and I think that like also needs to be emphasized. There's Dr. Rivka Schwartz, who spoke here over the summer or spring, she wrote an essay. She said, she teaches in high school, and she said, she tells her high schools that we want your sexual relationships to be ethical, healthy, and halachic. And that's our goal for you as teachers at this school. But even if they're not going to be halachic at this point in your lives, we still want them to be ethical and healthy. So I think that's another way of saying, I think, this basic point, right? That that also should be brought into our like evaluation of like our sexuality as as a community, as people in our community. That I think like teenagers like making out in the backseat of a car, like that's like ethically problematic because each one is manipulating the other for their own needs, right? There's no commitment, there's no love, there's no right. It's like sort of mutual. Taking advantage of the other, they're just like an agreement to take advantage of one another for their own gratification. Obviously, not every teenager, but like that could be, right? And then somebody who's much older in a more stable relationship, obviously it's like those ethical concerns could lapse, even as the Tuma V'Tara concerns might remain. So I think it's sort of worth like having a fuller conversation about sexuality and its like kind of connections to a life of Torah. Okay, thank you for staying late. And next week we're doing heresy and postmodernism. So thank you.
Come for the heresy, stay for the postmodern.
This was very good.